We've been working on a series of lessons regarding evidence of God. Today I want to kind of close that out a little bit, but I want to look at the atheist perspective. Not so much that there is no God, but I want to look at the idea of atheism as a form of religion, and I want to look at the faults and failings with atheism, because atheism is a form of religion. And oftentimes they are very devout in their belief that there is no God. To begin that, to set the stage, I'd like to go to Hebrews chapter 4. And this is written for us in Hebrews chapter 4. The Hebrew writer is writing to Christians, but I think it gives us a perspective on what we are to do when faced with the atheist and atheism as a religion. Hebrews chapter 4 verse 1 says, "Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For the good news came to us just as to them, but by the message they heard did not benefit them, because they were not united by faith. Those who were listened, for we who have believed entered that rest, as he said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again, this passage he said, they shall not enter my rest. Since therefore it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter it because of disobedience." So what the Hebrew writer is going back to, the book of Exodus, and in Exodus the Numbers and the children of Israel who wanted to enter the promised land. He's drawing a parallel from those who left Egypt on the journey to the promised land. And those who disobeyed God were not allowed to enter that promised land because they chose to disobey God. Rather than choosing obedience, they chose willingly to be disobedient. And so God promised them that they would not enter into that restful land. They would not have peace. They would not have prosperity in the land that was promised to them. So the Hebrew writer is drawing a parallel conclusion that for those who are disobedient to the gospel, those who have heard, those who have received the gospel, to be cautious lest they be drawn away into disobedience. And I think that's somewhere where we can be very easily drawn away into is the idea of evolution. And we can, because it is inundated everywhere, and we see it everywhere. It's taught as fact in so many places. We can be drawn away. And in fact, I mentioned it a couple of weeks ago, there are religions out there that claim to be Christian religions that have introduced evolution theory into their doctrines and teachings. And so we need to guard against that. We need to be careful not to be drawn into those doctrinal errors, lest we become disobedient to the gospel of Christ and therefore lose out on eternity. That's essentially what the writer is saying. We live in a world where evolution is taught as fact. Those of us who believe in God sometimes are mocked for our faith, for our belief in Him, and sometimes questioned, where is our defense? And so the last couple of weeks, we've looked at our defense in a perspective And we can go many different ways with our defense. For me, personally, one of the best ways is to look at the scriptures and see, as we identified the last couple of lessons, that God said something hundreds, in some cases thousands of years before man figured it out. For me, that is evidence of the existence of God, the wisdom of God. But there are other ways in which we can make our defense. But for the first time in centuries, Christians have had to make a defense of God. You know, when the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter and James and all those early apostles were writing the Word of God, they were making that defense. Because while there were some Jews who converted to Christianity, the primary audience that particularly the Apostle Paul was talking to were Gentiles. And they were into idol worship, and they were into paganism. While he may not have had to have convinced them that there was a God, he had to convince them that he served the true God. But ever since the first century, when Christianity spread throughout the world, for years, we have taken for granted that we don't need to convince people that there is a God. And so I believe that we are seeing a change in that. You know, as working at various booths and events and things, I realize that there are people out there who don't believe in God. And so we need to make a defense for God. But I want to notice something, though. I want you to notice something. We can't prove that God exists. And some people simply give up at that and say, well, it's faith. Some people have that attitude. I'm not willing to give up at that point. However, what I do want to say is scientifically. Science very well may prove that there is a God at some point. Science has proved the scriptures accurate in many places. But I do want to notice that we cannot give the world something tangible. God is a spirit. How do you catch a spirit? How do you make him real to the world? John chapter 4 and verse 4, I believe it is, says that God is a spirit, and those that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And so there's what we believe. But the psalmist, I want to go back, and this I think helps to verify. Psalm 14. The psalmist writes something that really is quite blunt in regards to those who say there is no God. And I've read this, and I think it's interesting. It says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. The psalmist is talking about the one who is a fool, who doesn't recognize that there is a God. In fact, just the mere wording of this psalm, that the psalmist says the fool. The fool is one who is void of understanding, void of knowledge. One of my basic arguments against the evolution theory is, how can something come from nothing? I've often said that the evolutionist, the atheist, has greater faith than I do, because I believe at least that there is a reason for everything. The atheists have no reason. But I want to talk a little bit about the atheist and their human logic and human nature. I want you to consider the Bible teaches us that deep inside, everyone knows that there is a God. So let's keep that in mind. Even the atheist, even the most devout atheist out there, I think the Bible teaches that they know deep in their heart that there is a God. The Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 1 touches on this. And you really, if you think about it, societies throughout the ages Ancient history, ancient societies have all reached for a God, a creator, a sustainer of all that we know. Romans chapter 1 and verse 19. The Apostle Paul says this, "For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them." In other words, God has given any person on the face of the earth enough evidence to believe in God. And if we drop down to Romans 1 and verse 20, the following verse says that because of the evidence, he says, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse." In other words, God is going to judge mankind based on the evidence that is in creation. And they will have to, whether scientists or non-scientists, they're going to have to give an answer for the reason that they rejected Christ. People who are atheists, people who believe in evolution, have convinced themselves that there is no God. I want you to entertain the idea that this is a process that they have gone through in their subconscious mind to decide that there is no God, is to defy the evidence that exists around us. And I'm not trying to be harsh on people who believe that there is no God, but they've gone through a process. And 9 times out of 10, when people go through that psychological process to convince themselves that there is no God, 9 times out of 10, it is because of something they have either experienced with religious people where we have failed and come short of the glory of God, as Paul says we all do from time to time in Romans chapter 3 and verse 23. So sometimes it's a failure of Christians to live to the standard that the Bible has set for us. Other times, and I think this might be the more prominent one, is that if there is a God, that would mean that these people would have to accept Christianity. They would have to accept the Bible as the Word of God, and they would have to make changes to their lives that because of sin in their lives, they don't want to, and they utterly reject. And so that's the reason that the evolutionist, the atheist, fights against Christianity so hard. You read their writings. There are a lot of atheists out there, and I apologize, I should have had some of the quotes, but there are a lot of atheists out there who will make statements. I can't believe in God because if I believe in God, then I will have to accept. And they'll list something that they don't want to accept about God. So that's the human nature and the human logic with which they're thinking. Oftentimes, they simply don't want to believe God is real because they don't want to make that change. They don't want to yield the will of God. So I want to think about, we've talked about evidences, and I still think that the evidences are the best way to approach someone who doesn't believe in God. However, if that does not work, I want to give you a different perspective on a different approach. And I found this quote because an atheist does believe in God, but does not believe that he believes in God. Does that make sense? He is simply a walking bundle of inconsistencies. In other words, one who does not believe in God has to believe in something, and we're going to look at the inconsistencies of evolution. We're going to look at the inconsistencies this morning of the atheist and the doctrines that are there. If this statement is true, and I believe that it is, and I believe that this statement is consistent with what Paul says here in Romans chapter 1, that there is enough evidence for everyone to believe that there is a God, then it is our job as Christians, might actually be easier than what we would actually think. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and in verse 1 of that chapter, Paul says, "Be ye imitators of me as I imitate Christ." We read that this morning in our Bible class. That might be the best solution for the atheist. What the atheist sees when they look at the Christian world is a group of people who are fractured and cannot agree on what the Bible teaches. And that's very sad. It's an unfortunate thing. And the only solution to that is that we get back to the basics. Back to just exactly what the Word of God says and not what I think or not what I want. Because we show sometimes inconsistencies when we're outside and divided on what the Word of God says. The Christian might only need to prove the atheist also are inconsistent by his or her actions, that he does indeed believe in a God. I want to look at those things. The first thing that you'll notice about the atheist, and I've got a lot of friends who they're probably not atheists, but they're more on the agnostic level. But they really aren't sure that they believe in God. If there is a God, it certainly is not a God who cares about us or what we do, how we live. It's not a God that sent his Son to save us on the cross. That to them is foolishness. But so my friends who are of this kind of persuasion, the atheist teaches that human beings are simply chemical accidents which evolved over billions of years, with the end result a long and purposeless chain of biological evolution. Think about that. That's what atheism teaches. That's what evolution teaches. Is that you and I had this long chain of events that slowly changed over billions of years. And so human beings are simply a product of evolution. But what I want you to notice is at the end of the day, the atheist will go home to his or her family and treats them as if they are valuable and irreplaceable. Human beings, individuals, deserving of love and respect. You'll notice it's the liberals, the atheists, who protest military actions in the street, oftentimes before Christians do. Why? Because they're concerned about human beings. And yet that's inconsistent with their religion. If human beings are simply an evolved biological evolution, I guess a chain, a purposeless chain, an accidental chain, what's wrong with the picture? We know that the Bible teaches that we're made in the image and likeness of God. Genesis chapter 1:26 says, "Let us make man in our image." And so we place, as Christians, we place a value on human life at any stage of that life. Whether that life is at conception or whether that life is at the end of its life, there's still a dignity and a value to human life and a respect for who that person is. The Apostle Paul talks about that kind of respect. And see, I think this is something, if we point out to the atheist, if you take God out of the equation, what is the world left with? Why is something wrong that we know to be right? We'll get to that in a little bit. But in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3, Paul says, do nothing from selfish ambition. Think about this. This is teaching us a selfless behavior. He says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. If God is out of the equation, why would anyone put someone else above themselves? Can you imagine what kind of a world that would be? A world without God is a place that I do not want to live. Paul continues on. He says, let each of you look not on his own interest, but also on the interest of others. You see, the atheist is inconsistent. Evolution teaches not the value of human life. It's the Bible that teaches the value of the human life. It is the Bible that teaches that man became a living soul that lives for eternity. The atheist is consistent.